We're just waiting a couple of minutes because it's not quite 11 yet, so we're waiting for people who were expecting for this to start at 11. Right, so it's 11 o'clock now, so we will get started. Thank you very much for coming here. Obviously, this title is very interesting for a lot of people, possibly because it's so wide. Surveillance, security, and privacy in IoT. Questions for the enterprise, answers from their suppliers. That's about as broad as you can get covering an event like this. So you might be thinking, how on earth are we going to be able to cover that in 15 minutes in that time constraint? Well, we're very lucky. We've got some absolutely excellent speakers here who will be introduced shortly. But what I'm going to do is just apologise for those who just arrived. You can tell my voice is going. Yes, it's definitely going. I haven't got anything catchy, so those guys, if you want to move to the front and get closer, that's not a problem. You won't get it. It is hay fever, and I will make all 15 minutes. I won't die before then, so we're all okay to go on that front. So, in terms of getting started on this, I'm not going to introduce our speakers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give them a couple of minutes, each to introduce themselves, and highlight the key things that are of interest to them. And secondly, just do their immediate response to that question. And then what we will do is I will then ask one question of each of our panelists. Then we will open it up to the audience, and I've got some questions in reserve as well. And hopefully we'll have covered a lot of the questions in terms of this title. I'm going to start on this end with Paul first. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, Sal, thank you very much. So my name is Paul Dorey. I'm a visiting professor at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm also the chairman of the Internet of Things Security Foundation, so you can get my interest now in this subject. To give you a bit of my background and why I'm interested in this in particular, people have asked me to describe my career, and it's sort of a serial CISO. So my career was at senior security and risk positions at Barclays and BP and other positions such as GSK. And when I look at this particular topic, I found out that I come at it from about 4 different angles, which is interesting. So the first angle is, yes, I pretty much had a digital career in security, so very much at the CISO end of things. So a lot of my experience is about how digital can be really powerful in what it can achieve, but also spending most of my time worrying about it going wrong and how it can be abused. When I was the operational risk director at Barclays, I learned about the power of digital data. The fact that we could detect patterns, the fact that we could look at frauds, and we could see things that were absolutely invisible until we turned the computers on, and that was an interesting experience there. At BP, when I was there, I had the pleasure for a number of years being co-head of both physical and digital security. So along with my colleague, we had to worry about the physical security of BP in 135 countries, and that was a real eye-opener. It was an eye-opener not only, again, in how digital started to make a difference to that world, but actually also we started to understand the power of bringing together corporate security thinking with digital security process and expertise. And we actually created some very interesting groupings of people who could think in very different ways. So I think that's part of the power. And then finally, through the Internet of Things Security Foundation, I'm actually spending my time with chip manufacturers and people who put those chips onto boards and then send those boards into devices. Sometimes the devices are toys, sometimes the devices are things that we would see around this area used in buildings to do with fire or security or sensing. And so I'm learning a lot about that. And so what I'm learning actually is that we really got to do something about IoT security, because we had trouble securing IT, we had trouble securing industrial control, but IoT, I think, is escaping and accelerating faster than most organizations even understand. So we're creating a problem, and we're unaware of the problem in many cases.
Thank you, Paul. Over to you, James.
Yes, well, it's great to be here with such a good panel and an interested audience. And I'm very happy to also advise that I work for a company called Unified Security, and basically we help organizations achieve convergence. That's our aim. We want to create and be involved and develop converged security centers in the future, and this is the way forward. And we're very pleased that Frank Gardner the other day commended this kind of approach. We couldn't ask for a better recommendation than that, and I feel that this is the way to go in the future. So my past is I'm very privileged to have worked with Paul at BP several years ago, and helped and was working in that area where the two teams worked very closely together, and it was a great privilege to have met Paul then. But it's also good to be working with Axis Communications, and in this area we have just published a white paper on the same subject as this, which will be freely available to anyone here who would like a copy, because it gives lots of information about what we can actually do now to comply with GDPR for the Internet of Things devices that you can see all around the show. And if it's just a start, at least, to get hold of this and to go through these 250 controls that are in there, that we think you should start there at least. Plus, we're also working with Paul on the Internet of Things Security Foundation Smart Buildings Working Group, which we are releasing today, and we would like to invite anyone who's interested in securing their Internet of Thing in their business, whether it's in the facilities management space, whether it's in another area such as design engineering or whatever, or an integrator, somebody who's actually putting in these Internet of Things into smart buildings. We would like to be working with you and encourage you to join our working group. So please get in contact with us, and that's probably enough for me.
Okay, thank you, James. Steve.
Thanks, Saab. Yeah, hi, I'm Steve Kenny from Axis Communications. I head up our industry liaison programme for UK and Ireland. And I guess we've been working heavily with the panel here on the convergence from the sort of physical security world into the IT world. And essentially we see the supply chain, the vendor integrator as being one of the biggest risks with sort of the cyber threats. So we've been looking at educating the physical security community, looking at how we can actually work with our partners to mitigate some of the risks that we're seeing. I have the privilege of working with Mike within ASIS International. I'm the Director of Solutions Information and Cybersecurity. So we're really trying to close the loop within the supply chain. We all have an obligation to understand cybersecurity and the threats it poses. It's not an IT issue, it's a business challenge and a business issue, and it's just understanding that actually suppliers and vendors can impact the business's compliance within the GDPR, which James mentioned. Essentially, we just need to work and partner together to become better at understanding the cyber risks.
Okay, I'm going to move you on to our last panelist, but before I introduce him, I should mention, if you were here and you know Barry, Barry was going to be our fourth panelist. Unfortunately, he's had a death in the family, so very kindly we've had somebody else step in this morning. So I'm going to introduce you to Mike Hurst. If you could tell us about yourself and your views on the topic that we're here to discuss.
Thanks, Saab. Yes, I am a last-minute replacement, but happy to be here. Mike Hurst. My day job, I recruit in security. I've been doing it for 25 years. I'm here today for ASIS, which is the Global Security Management Association. The thing I feel is, with IoT or whatever, with convergence, is so many companies miss bits of it. I'm very closely involved, as with James as well on the Enterprise Security Risk Management initiative that ACES is doing at the moment as a global initiative. And the key to it, I think, is so many things get left out. That whether it's IoT, whether it's supply chain that Steve mentioned, it's having that completely holistic approach to things. Because there are so many examples that these guys probably know better than me, where you've had a physical breach has led to a cyber incident, or vice versa. You have to look at all the things. There are so many factors, and it's bringing it all together. And convergence is a big part of that. IoT is a potential minefield. There was a guy, Ray Amaro, who was a Stanford professor, and something I often quote it. I'll probably get it wrong, but they call it Amara's law, is we tend to underestimate the importance of new technology. We overestimate things in the short term, but underestimate the importance in the long term. So everyone thinks it's going to happen tomorrow, and it won't do, but over that sort of 20-year period of time, things evolve. So it's getting it right now, so we can minimise those risks and threats and take that overarching approach to things.
Okay, thank you very much, our panelists. As you can tell, the experience and background of our panelists, it is very wide as the topic is in many respects. I'm going to ask one general question, if you could all comment on that, and I will come back to specific ones a bit later on. It's just that I'm aware that Mike has come on as an add-on and helping us out. So the first question for each of you, and I don't mind which order you want to answer it, so feel free to put your hand up. My question is, over here in our audience, we've got people from a variety of backgrounds. Why should anyone here in this audience be worried? And if they are worried, so the first question is, what is it they should be worried about? And then secondly, if they're worried about any of those things, what's the one question they should be asking their manufacturer of any of the IoT products that they are being supplied? Maybe in terms of some of the let's say the stands they go to out here, what's the one question that they should ask? I'm sure several of you have got several questions, but let's just start with the one first of all.
Okay. I have a simple question, apart from turn that bloody alarm off, which is, who is responsible for security? So if we look at an IoT device, the simple question that you ask is, who's responsible for the security of this device? And if you don't get a very good answer, which, by the way, you won't, but at least you should start a conversation.
Hello?
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Paul. Just to emphasise what Paul's talking about there, when I started, I didn't actually introduce myself and my background. I wanted to get onto the panelists, but one of the things I should have said was, about 14 years ago, I researched into the vulnerabilities of network CCTV systems. And 14 years ago at IFSEC, I came along and I spoke to many of the CCTV suppliers, and I said to them, tell me, what security do you have in your products? And every single one of them, without a shadow of a doubt, without blinking, said, oh, we leave security to the network level. And for years, I complained about the fact that security was not in the device itself, and it should have been. And I think that's what Paul's referring to, and that's partly what the title's about in terms of IoT. So yes, they should be thinking about it, they should know about it. And the other interesting thing about my question when I asked it 14 years ago was, I had one interesting answer, and that one answer was, we have 3 levels of security. And I was quite pleased. I thought, that sounds really good. I said, what are those 3 levels of security? He said, well, we've got a user-level password, we've got an admin password, and a super admin password. And my response to him was, let me just check. So what you're saying is, if someone is a bad hacker, and it takes them 6 months to guess your password, they will still get in, and you won't know. Secondly, if someone's a good hacker, and they've got tools, and they can run through hundreds of passwords a second, they'll get in within minutes, and you still won't know. Oh, he said. Anyway, that was a start. So with what Paul's referring to, it's a very good question to start with over here. Over to yourself, or whoever wants to be next. Steve.
Hi, Saab. Yeah, so from being from that side of the industry as a manufacturer, I guess I guess most people focus on the actual technology that's being deployed and specifically look at the features that are deployed in that technology. And essentially, yeah, that's hugely important, but that's the starting point. When we talk around the evaluation of the supply chain, I think people need to do their due diligence on the businesses that they choose to work with. What processes do they follow? What are their internal procedures? What regulations and standards do they align to? And then we can start to actually evaluate, do they have critical vulnerability policies? Systems and devices get hacked, but can they demonstrate how they're going to fix it? What are they going to do moving forward? And then I guess, how do they communicate that out to the channel as well? If people find a fault in their system, I think people need to be brave, open, honest, and transparent about how they're going to fix it. In the IT industry, this is something that we've done for 10 years. In the security industry, it's fairly new. People, to some extent, play top trumps with vulnerabilities and use it to play people off against each other. Microsoft fix vulnerabilities every Tuesday, and no one sees that as a problem. Whereas in the security industry, it can be frowned upon. And I think we need to be mature about this, and to move forward, people need to be open and honest.
Thank you, Steve. Anyone else want to take this?
Okay, slightly related to that, and on GDPR, who's responsible for the privacy settings of that device? And what's interesting here is that we do draw attention to this in our white paper, is that there is a difference between privacy and security. And it's important to notice that in the GDPR, we're talking about privacy, or now it's called data protection by design and by default, which we might come on to later. But privacy is the right to be let alone, the right to not be intruded upon. And information privacy is the right to have control over your data and where it is. And you've got that right. And so what's important is, what are these manufacturers doing about this, as well as the security? So it's a bigger picture than we're just looking at the security controls, which you do need to have, obviously. So that's what I'd also want to ask the manufacturers.
I'd agree with what's been said beforehand, and I probably would have said the same thing earlier on. I suppose the one thing I would add is the people. Don't forget the people. You've got systems, you've got technology, you've got to have the people, not to say trained, but made aware of what the risks are, how they can do things, because so many threats and risks manifest themselves not through malicious intent, but sometimes just through incompetence or lack of training. So don't forget that the person element to it as well.
Yeah, I think the other, tying that to a question, if I was going out today, the other question I would ask around that would be, just give me an idea of the number or the volume or the skills or the roles that you have in cybersecurity, or trying to make sure that your organization is building security into the device by design and default. Because as has been already said by several panelists, in the logical security or the cyber security world, the products that are available in that world, they have been secured in lots of different ways for many, many years, because they look at it right the way down to the code level. Whereas when we look at physical security products, often the code has been, or what goes into the device, the components have been taken from all over the place, and when they've taken them from various places, what hasn't been looked at is the security within the code, and has the code been developed or put together using secure coding practices. So my question would be, how big is your security team when it comes to developing the product itself, not just selling it? So that's a very important one in terms of employment and professionalism. Sorry.
I'll just come back to that. An analogy that I often use, I'm sure I stole it from someone else, is, because sometimes we're a bit behind things, but is if you buy a car, it's got brakes on it. You wouldn't buy a car without brakes, without door locks, without airbags now, without seat belts. These are built in. We assume they're there, they're stands, they're tested, they're built-in features. So it's just to bring it into the sort of everyday life. That's, it's always there.
Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, sorry. I think for me, what we've got to remember is we are a 40, 50-year-old industry that has come traditionally from the analog world. We absolutely sit in the IT world now. So the challenges that are being faced and the dynamics, they're different to what they were 10 years ago. So even down to the fact that are manufacturers embracing IT standards and policies? Are the people that are out there installing and commissioning these systems, if someone's got 30 years as a CCTV commission engineer, do they have the right skill set to actually commission an IoT device onto a corporate network? They're different skills, and can people demonstrate that actually, yeah, we've evolved with the time?
Okay, so I asked that question about who's responsible for security, and actually it's a trick question because the answer is everybody in the supply chain. So let me unpick that a bit with a lesson that we learned from IT. So I've been in IT so long that I remember when the computers didn't come with security, where you had to talk. I think we'll talk over that. I'm not that interested in stand locations next time. Or plus I won't. Did you all get that? Right. So what back then, we were trying to tell them that we wanted more than one password for an entire application. We wanted user IDs and logons, and everybody says, don't be stupid, in IT, of course you have user IDs and logons. That's what annoys us all. That's what creates all those passwords we forget. What we had to do was create a whole demand-supply requirement so that the end user organizations actually said, look, we need security to achieve certain things. The integrators then knew they needed to do it. The systems manufacturers then were able to provide it. So we actually need to build this whole chain of trust where the supplier actually finds a reason to build in security. Because frankly, if there's no demand, why would they do it? And so that whole economic model of reasonable cost for security embedded in security devices should be part of it. So I think when we unpick this supply chain thing, and I won't tell the whole story because you want to ask more questions on it.
I'm going to go to open questions to the audience in a second. But before I do that, two things I want to promote, because this session is also a launch for two things that are very related. One is what Paul's been talking about, the IoT Security Foundation, Smart Buildings and Cybersecurity Working Group. I have to show an interest in this because I'm the vice chair of the group together with James Willison. We are launching a workshop that's going to be taking place in September. If this is of interest to you, I'm not going to talk about it now, I'm only pointing out, then Paul is here, and Paul can talk about it as part of what he wants to cover. So that's one thing. So we're launching that here. The other thing is this document here that was mentioned earlier on. It's Smarter GDPR Assurance for a Smarter World. Again, I apologise, I have to show a personal interest in this. I co-authored this again with James Willison, and it's been sponsored by Axis. But if you would like a free copy of this, it will be available at the end of this session. But this does cover a whole range of things that are being talked about here. So there are copies of this. Right, so with that advert out the way, can I open up questions to the audience? And then I've got some other questions I'd like to ask the panelists as well. So any questions raised so far? Can we have a mic over here?
Hi. I do wonder if we are not at the risk of trying to apply the same... Sorry?
Can you say who you are, who you work for, and if your question is directed towards any of the panelists or for all panelists? Yeah?
Okay,
so
thank you.
Who you are, who you work for, the question, and who it's for.
I will try to remember that. My name is Alejandro. I work for Mighty. We are a facility management company, and I work in particular on how we use IoT in that space. So I'm very interested on this subject. My question, I think is for everyone, probably for the professor is the most applicable, is whether we don't have the risk of trying to replicate what we do in IT security into the IoT and that maybe will just not work in the sense that I cannot envision having millions and millions of devices everywhere and saying, look, I'm sure that every device is secure. So maybe the approach is different. Now we have to accept that sensor devices that measure temperature is okay if someone hacked them, but not a sensor that is managing a lift. So that's my question in terms of should we change the paradigm and what cybersecurity means in this space? And the other question is, I would like to know what security by design and privacy by design means, if someone can help me there.
Who wants to start us off on this?
Well, I'll start looking at the actual sensor and at device level. So when we look at Article 25, which is data protection by design and by default. So it's looking at the actual standard features that are built into devices. So when you say, if we're looking at the deployment of hundreds, maybe thousands of devices on the network, there are tools out there that are aligned to government standards that will enable you to harden multiple devices all at the same time. So actually, you're not having to do every single device individually, which it would be time consuming and it would cost a lot of money. So there are free tools out there that will enable you to harden the devices all in one go.
Can I, so it's often a common statement, particularly in academic work, that some of these devices are so underpowered and they just can't carry a full security stack. So I think to your point, how can we possibly apply security? I would say the answer is we have to look at the entire system. And so if you have very, very simple devices, then you can't expect them to do very much. So they have to be looked after by the architectures in which they sit. So without designing it here on a whiteboard behind me, which I'd probably love to do, we're talking about gateways and things that would offer some of those capabilities. So I don't think we should look at one single thing in isolation. We should look at it in terms of its management context, what it's capable of doing. And some of these IoT devices, they're Unix boxes. They're big and complex computers, and the more complex they are, the more security challenges they have, but the more capability we can use to leverage. So I wouldn't be put off thinking about appropriate security for IoT no matter where it occurs. Because if we don't, we know the weak one is simply where we'll be taken advantage of. That's the place where the break-in will occur, if you're happy with that as an answer.
And I also, in addition to that, I think the information cyber security areas have a lot of technology already available to the organization, which isn't being used by the physical security area or the building. So that there's already available systems. They could be monitoring systems such as a situation incident event management system, a SIM, which could be used to protect better these devices that are on the network, but they may not be, the organization might not know about them, but they hopefully will. But when they are, they could be incorporated into the existing technologies that are there. And that's what the point of what our Converged Security Center is trying to show you. Another advert, but that's one way you can use the existing technologies more.
Great. We've got a question here at the front. While we're getting the microphone there, one other point I'd make and add to is basically any device that you have, if you look at the network protocols, the network stack, as we call it in computer security, there are 7 layers. When I was researching into vulnerabilities of network CCTV systems 14 years ago, every single layer of the 7 layers, anyone was capable with a bit of intuition, bit of knowledge, bit of sort of playing around, you could figure out at least 2 or 3 different attacks on every layer of the network layers. So that's how easy it was, and the fact that it wasn't one vulnerability, we're talking several. And we're talking about device and the architecture of the device. And as Paul was saying, when we're talking about the whole system, that's where you should be looking at security, because not all security is built into the device. Sorry, question.
David Lawler from Alert Innovation. Just a general open question, picking up on exactly what this gentleman said and your answer to it, and the dichotomy of what Interpol yesterday said to the same question, and they said to do what he said, apply the Pareto principle, figure out, you've only got so much budget, figure out the most vulnerable things and throw your money there and leave the other 80%. And you gentlemen have all said, no, secure everything. So head of Interpol cyber intelligence yesterday said, do what he said, and you all said, don't do everything. How does that stack up?
Can I qualify that? You can't have things that have a trust relationship with something that's weak. So you have to create groupings of things of similar security and capability. So the secure everything is bring everything of a similar, that has to trust other components to a similar level of security, because it's the one element that weakens you. That doesn't mean everything's got to be part of that same grouping. So I don't disagree with the idea that it's all about risk, isn't it? So you have to prioritize it based on risk. But we mustn't forget, the trouble with IT systems is it's the context of the relationship. And if there's a one weak point into a network, then that's the point it'll be taken advantage of. So the trick is you don't put everything on the same network. It's stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I also comment on that? I think what Paul just mentioned in there is if you were looking at putting together a security of an enterprise, you start by doing a risk analysis. You can't mitigate the risks until you know what the risks are. Now, sometimes you self-insure, you accept a certain level of risk, certain things. But sometimes, I know we talk about IoT here, but sometimes I get a bit fed up talking about cyber security, physical security, everything. It's just security. It's the same thing. I go to conferences, I got too many conferences. I go to CISO conferences, CSO conferences, general stuff, and the people talk about the same risks, the same problems, the same communication things. Doesn't matter what world it's coming from, whether it's a cyber thing, it's just security. And okay, the details vary from, but you've got a chab lock on your door or something, which is, it works. It's not a high security thing, but that's that. If you have a building, you have a layered defence. I'm sure we've got people here who are experts in cyber stuff. I'm not, but it's the same. I feel it's the same procedures, same principles, cut right across. And you've got to, what do you worry about? You worry about everything. Certain things you say, fine, because some things are likely to happen, but the consequences are quite small. Some things are very unlikely to happen, but the consequences are quite big. So it's getting that graph and working out where you pitch it. So you absolutely can't, that Pareto's law thing is probably true to, but it's just take that holistic approach.
Can I just have a quick show of hands? Then we've got a question at the back there. If we can get a microphone to gentleman at the back. Quick show of hands. Does anyone know what GDPR stands for? Good, excellent. And you've all been walking around. Yes, it's a general data protection regulation. And I will come on to that in a second because it's tied in with what we've got and we're supposed to be looking at. Sorry, question.
Hey, I'm Tom. I work for Google.
Sorry, can we turn the volume up?
Can you hear me better? Cool. I'm Tom. I work with Google in Ireland. I work between our physical security teams and manufacturers, testing things, bringing things in. How do we encourage these manufacturers to actually think about security? Because currently they laugh when we report things to them and they don't think it's necessary.
I'm going to make a comment there before I pass on to our manufacturer on the panel. It's not easy, it takes time, absolutely. As I said, I looked at it 14 years ago, and there are manufacturers here where they have not changed a single thing in 14 years, but there are other manufacturers that have. So having said that, I'm going to pass on to our manufacturer on the panel.
Thank you, Saab. So being the manufacturer on the panel, it looks at the supply chain, and if we look at the maturity of their cyber business, I think one of the things is, do they have a critical vulnerability policy? That's absolutely key. What are the communication channels? Do they have a representative within their business that takes ownership and responsibility for that? If they don't, how can you possibly communicate with them? You can't go on the internet and go on their webpage and register an inquiry. So I absolutely understand that. But again, with the National Cybersecurity Centre's Code of Conduct, they document that businesses should have a vulnerability policy. And if they don't have a vulnerability policy, why? So it's got to be part of the evaluation process of the companies that you choose to work with. We work in an IT world, the IoT world. Things are going to find vulnerabilities. If it's not today, it might be 5 years down the line. But how can your vendor demonstrate that they're going to fix these problems, even if the technology has become end-of-life?
I actually think you're preempting one of the things we're looking to achieve with the smart buildings work and the IoTSF, which is actually to help create procurement language. Because it's when the system integrator, when the facilities manager, when the enterprise moving into the building that's a bank and cares about these things start to say, by the way, this is the stuff you're going to put into the procurement document because you won't even get shortlisted if you don't meet it. And then what assurance will be put onto that to make sure it really happens. On the retail side, we're seeing a little bit, I mean, cloud pets were delisted by eBay and Amazon recently, following them being able to be hacked yet again. These are children's toys that had weaknesses. Now, I know it's not the same situation, but it's actually even harder in retail than it should be in enterprise, because frankly, it's a spec. And if they don't meet the spec, then they really shouldn't get the business.
Yes, and if I could just add again to that, is the movement towards a certification or a label or a recognized standard that the manufacturer complies to on the box, which we haven't got yet for IoT, but we're working on that. Again, in the foundation is working on that, is that right? And other labels, a NIST label or whatever, something recognized in the procurement process, yeah.
Yeah, can I just add to it? Because we actually talk a lot about there being a label on something, but in enterprise you don't need a label on it. You just need a statement of conformance and require that as part of the process. And that's true if you're buying something that emits radio signals. Does it meet a particular radio standard? Yes. Statement of conformance. We can do the same with security.
And what you will find over a period of time is some of the suppliers here will conform to those, and there will be the ones that are beginning to make it in that market, and you'll get some that don't, and they'll end up in the consumer market where there isn't those requirements. But what you will also find, perhaps over a period of time, is things that these devices should not have. So, for example, if it's not relevant for them to have Bluetooth for whatever insecure reasons, you will find that specified in some particular environments and so on. So this will happen over a period of years. And I don't know if anyone remembers, about 3 years ago, the world's largest distributed denial of service attack took place. It took down a lot of the key part of the infrastructure, the internet infrastructure, and that attack used vulnerable one particular brand of CCTV cameras. Yeah, it was a botnet. Some of the bad guys got a whole network of all one type of camera because they found a vulnerability. We've seen it happen once. It doesn't mean it can't happen again. It may not happen in terms of the targeted attack being towards the critical infrastructure that we rely on in terms of the internet. It could be towards your company. It could be towards one of your competitors, and you could get the blame for it. Yep. So it can happen, and it will happen in terms of, as you start asking for standards and you start making sure that certain specifications are included, certain suppliers will end up at the lower end of the market, and they're the ones that were supplying those products that will get most abused and used. Right. I want to move on now in terms of our questions. We've had a lot of questions, and a lot of them have been looking at in terms of suppliers. And we have just started, just in the last question and the answer, started looking inward as to what she would be doing. So apart from looking at our own specifications, what other things should we be doing in our own organisations to actually start preparing for the convergence perhaps, or for making sure we don't end up vulnerable like a few weeks ago or a few months ago. Did anyone see in the news there was a thermostat which was in a fish tank in a casino, which was vulnerable, and an attack was launched. So first of all, the hackers broke into the thermostat, then used it to break into the rest of the casino network. Anyone see that? No? Well, if you want to try and prevent those things, let's find out from our panelists what it is you should be doing internally when you go back from here. Anyone want to start us off in first question? Let's say one key question you should be asking, and then we'll take it from there, if that's okay.
Okay, my answer was going to be different to that. It was just going back to what I said before about the enterprise security risk. It's having that, look at the whole thing. You know, there's an example. Was it Home Depot or Target a couple of years ago where they got for the air conditioning, wasn't it? Air conditioning. That was a physical breach. They broke in and stole the login details, didn't they? I believe. And so it's having that, looking at everything, looking at all the avenues, all the ways in, all the routes in, and you know, protecting and mitigating and procedurally and training and is everything. Is everything for me anyway.
For me, it's making everybody within the business aware that actually they can impact cybersecurity. And if you look at human behaviour, clicking on phishing emails, plugging in a USB stick, so it's just making that awareness level that actually it doesn't need to be a sophisticated hack that could take down a system and compromise the business. It's very basic and very straightforward things. Company policies, please don't plug a USB stick in if you find it outside on the floor. If you don't know who sent that email, don't click on the link and put in your details. Very straightforward, very simple. Don't go to the coffee shop over the road and jump on their Wi-Fi, because it might not be their Wi-Fi. So the very basic, very straightforward things that can actually mitigate a large majority of the risks.
Thank you.
And I'll just add, on this, my favourite subject is cross-functional teaming, or multidisciplinary teaming. And what was really interesting about 2 years ago, people may have heard of Bruce Schneier. He gave a great talk at IFSEC Security Europe, and he said the reason why the Sony attack was successful, wasn't necessarily the really brilliant hacking abilities of the attackers. It was the pathetic organizational response from Sony. They were not responding collaboratively, mainly individually, worried about their pensions or whatever it might be, which is understandable, but they did not have a cross-functional teaming response, and he declared that, and that's how I think that this issue can be solved better.
Thank you. Paul?
So let me pick up on the last two comments in particular. So first of all, if you're not bringing all your expertise to bear in your organization, then you're not doing as good a job as the attackers are, because they don't have stovepipes. So they will share information amongst their entire organization to attack you, whereas we go, oh, well, we don't really talk to those guys because they're technical, or those guys are all about security. So you know, there are IT security people who know how to solve network security problems. They just need to be part of the conversation to make it happen. And so you know, companies need to leverage their capability. On the psychological side, you're right, it's everyone's job. But actually, I don't think we should be quite as disparaging about the way people behave, because human psychology, there are reasons why people do that stuff. And there are also reasons and ways we can use psychology to overcome that. I'll plug a book I helped write, which is called The Weakest Link. And it's all about how psychology allows people to be undermined in terms of their digital behavior, and how we can use psychology to change that thinking. And I think psychology of the way that teams work plays to this as well, in answer to James's comment.
Also, that whole general principle I'm going off the subject slightly again, is the government's prevent strategy for the terrorism. It's the same thing. It's being aware of what your colleagues, your teammates, your network are doing. Now, sometimes it's just good management. It's looking after people who could be suffering from mental illness, pressure, everything else is different, changing behaviour. So having that team building, then what Paul said, having the team thing, getting all the talents together, looking at everything, it's a lot of it just common sense, and I do think that sometimes we get too focused on a technical solution, which of course we need. You've got to have the technical stuff, you've got to have the brains to do that, but you've got to look at the, it's a mixture of everything. I agree with everything what everyone said, really. It's what Steve said, what James said, what Paul said. It's a bit of everything.
Just a comment there in terms of the everything side of it, and you've mentioned the Sony attack a few years ago. Sony have had a few attacks, not one, and there are different parts of the business. The one that you guys have been talking about is Sony Entertainment, not Sony Pictures, and there have been others, as I said. The Sony Entertainment's one, that's the one that was related to the PS4 or the PS side, the gaming side of the business. One of the issues they had, and why it's so important in terms of what you guys are saying, in terms of managing risk, is one of the issues that Sony found was they were, as being a media company, they were used to not working on security. As a media company, they were used to being open with so many different projects that you could start a project just like this, and there was very little control in how they managed that project. And part of the problem, and leading up to the point, is that because they were doing those sorts of things, they found themselves in a situation where over a period of time, Sony had over 4,000 domain names connected with Sony Entertainments that either they owned directly or indirectly, because they were working with media companies, and somebody would say, oh yeah, do you know what, on your behalf we could set up this website for you, you can do this, you can do that. And Sony would say, yeah, Sony Entertainments would say, yeah, go ahead and do it. So they had so many different domain names alone that they didn't manage properly, and that's just one example of where there was a lack of control, where there should have been some control in terms of managing some of the risks. So in terms of what the guys here have been saying, that you should be worried about everything, yes, they are right, and the way to look at this perhaps is in terms of compliance. So I want to move us on to compliance now. Sorry, did you want to make a point first? Sorry? I was told we're finishing at 10:02. That's the time on the outside. It was 11:50. Yep. Oh, good. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Yes, we've got another 5 minutes. So I wanted to move us on to compliance very quickly. But before I do that, I did want to ask if there was any other questions in the audience to confirm that. We've got one question there, and then finally we're going to finish with compliance.
Yeah, just picking up on all these points and what you're saying, I think we're missing one thing that, as an owner of a security company for 30-odd years, we're completely bound and tied by NSA and others, SSAIB and so on. And whenever there's a curve of technology advancement, they are dinosaurs stuck in the analog world and they are miles behind, yet they are the people. If they were as IT relevant as you guys, and you're talking about a spec and so on, if they were up to scratch, all these manufacturers would have to be up to scratch because we won't be able to buy it. And they are consistently stuck in the analog world, miles behind. And when they try and catch up, they try and apply analog rules to IT. How can we bend that bit of standard to make it fit this? And they're the people that you should be targeting.
So as the vendor on the panel, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. But if we look beyond that, so these are associations, the SSAIB, NSI, organisations like that, totally agree with the information that they're pushing out. But what we need to be mindful of is that we had the Data Protection Act, we've now got GDPR, we've got the NIS directive. So these are regulations that sit above these guys, and that is what the manufacturers need to demonstrate compliance to before it gets to the SSAIB and SIA organisations.
I just think in our industry, they have more teeth for us and the manufacturers than that standard, because if we've got to give an NSI certificate and he comes and inspects us, who really, unless you get reported, comes and inspects you to GDPR? But the NSA come all the time and pick your jobs. So if there's more teeth with a regulatory body than a wonderful standard that we hope people apply to. And if nobody reports you for GDPR, nobody's going to do anything about it.
That is a very good point, but we are running out of time. And what I was going to move us on to, if you don't mind, the panellists will be around and you can ask them directly. Last thing for the panellists in terms of compliance and just rounding things off. So if you don't mind saying very quickly what you would like the audience to take away with in terms of compliance in rounding this off and finishing it off. Just one quick point, and I think then we're done. Time is definitely out then. Paul.
I'm chairman of a foundation that has a free standard set available on its website. So wherever you sit in that supply chain, download it and look at what it means to you.
I'd just like to emphasize, as a different role as an academic advocate for ISACA, is that you should collaborate, because recently their president, Matt Loeb, said you wouldn't really understand the GDPR on your own. You're much better off discussing all areas of the GDPR with as many different functions as you can, so that you talk across all functions, and that way you might have a better chance of understanding it, because you won't, however good you are, however legally aware you are, you will not really understand it unless you talk to others who are looking at the same risks as you, perhaps, but they're in a different business function to you. So, okay,
sorry.
That's what I suggest.
And as the manufacturer, I'd just like to leave the comment that whilst no manufacturer is going to make any business compliant to GDPR or aspects like that, our behaviour and the technologies we deploy can make people non-compliant. So do the due diligence on the technologies that you're pushing into your customers.
I'll agree with them.
My last sort of comment in terms of the takeaway would be, if your manufacturers and your integrators and your suppliers are not building in the controls for you to be compliant, you're going to have to retrofit them in afterwards. Doesn't it make sense for you to make sure that they fit them in so you don't have to do it? Okay, with that done, I'd like to help me thank our panellists. And if you are interested in the white paper or getting involved in the IoTSF, guys are here, and we're going to move off the stage because I think the next lot of speakers will be coming in as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.